My name is Shayna Lang. I am the Community Engagement Coordinator, and I just started within just a couple weeks ago, but have been a part of their mission in Colorado for a while, and really excited to increase partnerships across the state to really support service providers or educators as they're working with students with intellectual disabilities, and helping them be prepared for the college options that are available. For those of you that haven't heard about IN prior to this webinar, we are a nonprofit that works across the state of Colorado to support inclusive college options for students with intellectual disabilities. The focus on those college options are academic success and growth, social development, and then career advancement as well. One disclaimer that we want to provide to everybody is that IN does not provide those services to the students on those college campuses, but we work to increase awareness across K-12 educators, disability service providers, and just the community at large that college is an option for students with intellectual disabilities. And then we work to support those programs that offer inclusive services to make sure that they're meeting high expectations, research-based practices, and encouraging them to continue increasing their support of students. So we get to raise awareness, get people involved, but we're not the ones with the actual practical input with students. And so we're grateful for the programs that we do have that are doing great work with those students. But we want to be a resource to you and a way for us to just connect you to the necessary programs and supports. Okay, so for today, we have just an hour to go over this really big topic of how do we prepare students for college, those that have intellectual disabilities. That's a pretty robust conversation. And so we're really going to be able to have a 1,000-foot view as best as possible over these three categories. So my hopes are that as you guys leave this webinar, you'll be able to understand the college options available for students with intellectual disabilities in our state. And then from there, that you'd be able to identify the essential skills for college preparation. And ultimately, the bulk of our time is how can you begin developing a plan to introduce those strategies and those skills into your classroom or the service area that you have right now. A lot of this webinar is going to be geared towards service providers or educators, but we hope that there's benefit to family members that are joining us as well. So just so you guys have clarity on where we're headed, this is also how my brain works. I love to provide an outline of what's really the focus as we go through this next hour. So of those three categories, the first, we're going to start with how you can know about college options. We're going to go over the quick history about how inclusive higher education became an opportunity here in Colorado, the 3 levels of support that are available to students with disabilities in college, and then specifically camping out on inclusive college pathways for students with intellectual disabilities. And then from there, equipping you to share college options with your students. So identifying what are some of our assumptions or biases that tend to keep us from doing that. What are some normative pathways that we can start introducing college options to the students that we serve? And then lastly, how do we actually prepare those students with a wide variety of disabilities and abilities to be ready for college options in Colorado? So we're going to hit on academic and non-academic skills and then hone in on tangible techniques that you can start utilizing today. And that's really my hope, that the skills we talk about or strategies we talk about don't feel like 5 years down the road kind of an option, but it feels like a right here, right now, I can start these conversations, start these techniques to better support the students that we work with. All right, so we're going to dive right into knowing about college options. So this is a large overview of the history of disability services in higher education across the nation. So really starting in 1880s is when we had the initial schools and universities providing services to specific students with disabilities. This is very limited. Often it was working with students who were deaf and hard of hearing or blind. But eventually it started the process of increasing access to students of all disabilities and abilities to go to college. So that really launched with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act in 1973, which initiated the concept that all institutions, all public service programs would not discriminate against those with disabilities. So it was just opening the door for those that would already be pursuing higher education to not be discriminated against. And then continuing in that, when we hit the Section 2 of Americans with Disabilities Act 1990, this is the ADA law that is often talked about at the college level. This law was put into place to make sure we were actually providing auxiliary aids, appropriate accommodations to increase access for those that were being admitted into college that had disabilities. So these are really pivotal laws, huge, important. But the reality is that it was still limited to those that were able to be admitted to colleges and were able to meet that criteria. So there was still this population, most of the students that we work with intellectual or developmental disabilities, that were still experiencing this cliff after K-12. What happens when we finish high school or transition? Where do we go? And so in 2008, the US authorizes Federal Reauthorization of Higher Education Act. So this put in place opportunities across the states for students with intellectual disabilities to pursue college. It was a different format, but it was integrated and inclusive, and it was really, really pivotal for that population of students. And then it took a little while, but eventually Colorado caught up. And in 2016, we offered our first 3 programs in Colorado for students with intellectual disabilities. So these are programs that were serving students that otherwise would not be able to attend college or meet the typical criteria for admittance. And so it was launched by IN, which was organized by a group of families and educators and advocates in the community, and fought for inclusion for these students so that there's meaningful outcomes in their future. Which has been so exciting to see since 2016 when those pilot programs started. Now we've seen graduates who are doing amazing things in their community and accomplishing the goals that they set before they went to college. And so we have about 70 students that we're serving amongst 3 schools for students with intellectual disabilities. And we'll touch base on those 3 in a little bit. And then most recently, as we're looking at this history, we just passed the House bill, Inclusive Higher Education Opportunities, to expand these programs. So our hope as IN is that it would just become a part of higher education fabric of all institutions all across our state, that there's programming in place for students with intellectual disabilities to continue their education and to specifically develop skills that are going to equip them for a meaningful career. So we're excited for all the work that's been done in Colorado. Thank you for all of you, the ways that you've participated in that. And we're hopeful that as we continue to raise awareness, that students and educators and families would start to see that there are several open doors across our state for students with ID to go to college. So with that, we are going to look at the 3 different service areas or types of services that students with disabilities can receive at the college level. So the first is just what we would consider disability services. This is essentially what's required based upon the 504 and the ADA laws. So at all higher education institutions, students can identify that they have a disability and receive services from their disability services office. This might be at larger institutions, a pretty substantial office. At smaller institutions, it might be 1 to 2 persons who are offering these services, but it is required by law that every institution has disability services. The difference with this is that students have to be traditionally accepted to the university or that college program before accessing these services. So they have to meet that typical criteria for admittance, and then they'd be able to self-disclose that they have a disability and that they need some additional supports. You're going to see a wide range of disabilities that are served, whether it's chronic health, ADHD, mental health, doesn't really matter. As long as they meet that entrance criteria, they can self-disclose and receive supports. The component of disability services is that they do not offer any modifications. They can only offer accommodations, making sure that every student is still meeting the same essential outcomes in each course. So you'll see a list of those examples. Common accommodations include extra time on exams or quiet locations, scribes or assistive technology, things that create access for the student to show what they know, but do not modify the expectations of the course. So again, you're going to see this at all institutions. The reality is that not all of the students that we serve would be able to be successful with just those supports in place. So there's another layer. We call these comprehensive services. These are not required of all institutions. You'll see across the state that there are a couple programs that specifically offer comprehensive services that go above and beyond accommodations, and oftentimes are focused on more of that social development, career advancement component. So these are only going to be offered at certain institutions as well. The students still have to be traditionally accepted or admitted to the university before receiving comprehensive support. And they also have to self-disclose, just like they would with disability services. They offer a variety of support for students with various disabilities, but a lot of times we're going to see students that struggle with executive functioning, maybe autism spectrum disorder, that can continue in their academics well, utilizing accommodations, but need some outside support for executive functioning and managing their time. Most of the students are going to be using disability services and then also using comprehensive supports on top of it. So these types of programs, I'm going to send you guys a handout that lists the comprehensive services available in our state currently, just so you can see how you can funnel students appropriately to these different layers of support. So with those two, we still have our students with intellectual and developmental disabilities that wouldn't be able to typically be admitted to college. Maybe that's because they are unable to take the ACT or SAT tests, or because they require modification to content in order to fully participate. And so that's where inclusive services come into play. That's where our inclusive higher education programs come. And that's what was started in Colorado in 2016, was programs specifically for students that were not traditionally accepted to college programs. And these also are only offered at a couple of schools currently. The hope is that we're increasing that, but currently we have 3 schools that I'll share a bit about. And the outcome for students in these programs, they're able to receive accommodations. They're also able to receive modifications. And because of the modification component, they don't receive a typical degree like a bachelor's. Instead, they're receiving a certificate. It is still accredited by the institution. It's still meaningful. In the state of Colorado, we call that the Comprehensive Higher Education Certificate, where they are taking courses all across the course catalog that are focused on their career outcome. They're completely integrated into those classes and just have additional support to modify the curriculum as needed. So that's a really big, unique component of inclusive services and inclusive higher ed. There's more intensive staff and peer mentor support to guide them with the transition, downtime at the college level, ways to study, ways to organize. So they're pretty robust in their support to students outside of the classroom as well. And so the support domains that we talk about within inclusive higher ed is academic, social, vocational, and independent living. So I think with those 3 categories, that's a lot of information just to kind of take in. It's helpful for us to consider and for you to think about the students that you serve or people that you know if that would fit into those categories. So consider a student who is on a 504 plan in high school that receives accommodations, maybe like scribe or extended time on exams, continues to take classes with their typical peers, and really wants to pursue a career in maybe journalism, but they would be able to be successful with accommodations, and they'd be able to take entrance exams to be able to get there. They just need support once they get into the classes to have accommodations. That type of a student is going to really funnel towards typical college admittance and using the disability services. Some other students that you might think about, those maybe with autism spectrum disorder, those that are struggling with executive functioning, that are able to meet that academic requirement of college, but need additional support on the social level or interaction level, that would often be pointing those students towards universities that have comprehensive services. And then when you're thinking about students that are on IEPs, they're taking their classes in a severe support needs classroom, or most of their coursework is not in the general education class. Even if they have severe barriers with their disability, the reality is that there's options available for them using inclusive higher education services. So we really want to point them in that direction. The component that we're looking for is that those students would have a desire to go to college and a career goal that would align with the need for further education. So these are kind of the 3 categories that you can access in Colorado, and we're going to spend the bulk of our time focusing on those inclusive services and how you can prepare students with intellectual disabilities to be able to go that route and utilize those services in Colorado. So when we talk about inclusive services, we're looking at this chart of what are the key pillars of an inclusive higher education program. And I've mentioned this before, but it's always good to reiterate that it's very comprehensive. We want academic, high expectations in academics. We want them integrated into classes, receiving credit for that credential that they're getting. They are an admitted student to that campus and receiving a credential that's meaningful. And that they would have high standards even as they receive accommodations and modifications. We also see in these inclusive programs that there's a social component. We want them to learn how to collaborate across campus, participate in clubs and events, to experience volunteer roles or leadership roles, and to have that full experience of that personal development and social development that comes. And all of it is really hinged on a career outcome. Students that are attending inclusive higher education programs need to have some kind of direction or pathway that they want to go to have a more meaningful career or employment. So we want them to have some coaching. They're going to have career assessments, employment progression. So one of the unique things about an inclusive higher ed program is that students are able to start with job shadowing, and then maybe they can have a work study position on campus, and then maybe they're doing an internship in the community where there's a progression of support, that they're taking on more and more responsibility and more career exploration so that they're ready to jump into a meaningful employment situation when they graduate. And then there's also a level of independence. Most of our schools of the three have residential living options. There's a component where peer mentors are going to equip them to talk about life skills and self-advocacy and self-determination. So really, when we're looking at inclusive higher ed, it's a holistic view. And so that means that the skills that we're starting to teach our students now should be holistic, and that we can focus on, yes, academics, but also non-academic skills. So just as an overview, if you guys don't know already, the three schools that we currently have that are inclusive higher education programs dedicated for students with intellectual disabilities in Colorado is Elevate at ACC. So that's our community college program in Littleton. We also have the Office of Inclusive Services, which is in Colorado Springs. And then we also have GOAL, which stands for Go On and Learn, which is at UNC in Greeley. So all of these schools are working with several students at a time. We have 16 to 25 within a program year with intellectual disabilities that are fully integrated into campus, taking meaningful courses and really growing in their career readiness. That was a lot of overview in terms of the history of higher ed and disability services and inclusive higher education. So I just want to pause and see if we have any questions about that information so far. And if you guys do have questions, go ahead and throw those in the chat.
Shayna, can you hear me?
I can. Hi, Bob.
Hi. So for a lot of these students, do they go through the same financial aid FAFSA process and everything else that a typical student would go through too, and access financial aid in the same way?
Good question. So the three schools that we have are CTP certified, which means that they've been able to receive financial aid opportunities for the students at those schools. So all students that are going to ACC, UNC, or UCCS are encouraged to fill out the FAFSA, where they would figure out how much financial aid they're able to receive. The difference is with these types of programs, because of the credential they receive, they have access to grants and work study, but they don't have access to loans during, like, in that FAFSA process. And Tracy, feel free to jump in if that's incorrect. So we also encourage a lot of those students to be connected with DVR, Division of Rehab, so that they can get some additional financial support from their DVR program, so that that can add some of that or fill the gap where those loans are not available.
Sounds good. Can you give an example of how DVR might support a student in the college setting?
Yes. I'm going to go ahead and default to Tracy on that. Do you want to share an example for us?
Yeah, hi. So there's lots of community resources. I was just going to chime in and add that scholarships are also, there's tons of scholarships available, but DVR helps in a couple ways. Students on a needs basis can apply for tuition and books and that type of thing. They do take the family's income into account for that. And I'm not sure the exact cutoff for DVR, but that is definitely needs-based. DVR also supports students on the vocational side while they go. So they support the students in their vocational portion of their time in college. The other resource that is helping out a fair amount of students is their CCBs. So through their waivers, and then some of the CCBs also have mill levy funds that they've been able to use towards the students' academics and college needs.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, Bob. All right, I'm going to keep on rolling, but like I said, feel free to throw questions in the chat. So our hope then is if you know about these college options, you know about some of the details, then we want you to be sharing these with the students that you serve or the student that you parent or caregive for. And so it's important for us to address some of our assumptions and maybe biases as to why we haven't shared about college options previously. Sometimes that's purely out of lack of knowledge. This is new to Colorado. But then there's sometimes where we ask the question, is it fair for us to present college to students with really severe disabilities that they wouldn't be able to attend? And so what our job is within, what our hope is within, is that we would start to tear down that barrier and say, we want to provide this as an option to anybody, because we believe that these inclusive higher education services have robust supports to guide students in self-determination and goal achievement and meaningful outcomes. And so what I encourage us to do is to look at normative pathways. Normative pathways is, what would we do for any other student at this age in their life? A lot of times we're asking the questions, what do you want to do when you grow up? What college do you want to go to? That's pretty normal for our typical students in the K-12 worlds. And so we want to have that same kind of process when we're working with students with disabilities, no matter the limitation that their disability causes. So when we're looking at general education, often the perception is that nearly everybody in the general education population will go to college. Therefore, we're presenting college prep and strategies and asking those questions to everybody. And then the reality is that not all of those students do go to college. They get to make their own informed choice. And we want the same to be true for our special education students. Right now, the perception is that very few would be able to, and that's because of lack of resources in the past. And so we don't communicate as much about college options to them unless we perceive their ability to go. So the reality is that there is now more opportunity, more space for students with even severe disabilities to be able to attend college. And so we want to open up that conversation in all of our special education arenas. So when you're asking, is it realistic for me to share this with any of my clients or my students? The reality is that we want to present this option as an option for all students and allow them to make an informed choice. Sometimes students are going to be overwhelmed by the reality and the process to have to attend college, and that's okay if they don't want to make that decision. Or maybe they don't have a career goal that lines up with needing to go get more education, and that's okay too. We want to make sure that they're the ones pulling away from the option of college rather than us withholding the information. So this mentality, as we're talking about skill development and college preparation, I refer to as the even if mentality. So even if the students that you're working with don't choose to go to college or decide that they're unable to do so in the future, the skills that you would be building in them are still going to benefit them in the long term. It's still going to ready them for a more meaningful job or more meaningful community engagement. And so we really want to use this college preparation in the special education world with that even if mentality. These are beneficial skills for them no matter where they go. And especially if they want to go to college, we want them starting those skill set early and often. And we've seen since 2008, when that initial pilot program in our US started, we've seen clear links between student goals and communicated teacher expectations. So when service providers or teachers can say, I have this high expectation of you and I believe in you, students start to create goals that are more high achieving. And then we've also seen a link between high expectations leading to positive transition outcomes. So here, after these years of these pilot programs being in action, here's the data that we're seeing. We're seeing that there's a 135% increase in employability of students with intellectual disabilities after they complete one of these inclusive higher education programs. They have more social skills. They have more awareness of how to share their strengths and their weaknesses so they're able to withstand and persevere in employment settings, which is amazing. We're seeing 102% increase in wages. We're seeing 28% decrease in food preparation industries, and 59% drop in cleaning and maintenance occupations. So students that are going through these inclusive college pathways are not being funneled to one route for their type of employment. They're able to offer more opportunities, be creative and intentional with the jobs that they're seeking after their college education. And we're also seeing 300% increase in healthcare professions, which is a huge increase, I think, in an arena that a lot of people thought individuals with intellectual disabilities couldn't be. And now they are, and they're doing great work. So overall, we're seeing that college with the certificate programming, inclusive higher education programming, that they're leading to students having competitive, meaningful employment. And over on the right, you'll see that image where even in addition to the employability that's coming along, we're also seeing lifelong learning increase in these students, community engagement, and just a fulfilling future. And it's so fun that we get to talk with these students and hear their stories and just see them come alive, that they're figuring out who they are, what they're about, what they want to do, and they're actually making a difference in their communities. So your impact as an educator, a parent, a service provider is really big. And so these are two quotes that are just something that stand out to me. It says, teachers' expectations have a greater impact on a student becoming employed or going to college than will a student's skills or disabilities. And research has established that most persistent, self-disciplined, adaptable, and reliable students often outperform those with higher cognitive abilities. So our hope is that we're not limiting the options of our students just based on cognitive abilities or current level of skills, but that we're believing that development of soft skills and academic skills is going to ready them for a meaningful future, and in particular, being able to go to college. Okay. So now, starting the conversation, how do you actually begin offering this information to the students that you work with? So I just encourage routinely asking about post-secondary goals, making that a part of your vernacular. What do you want to do? What do you want to be? Where do you want to go? Inviting guest speakers with disabilities to share about their post-secondary experiences or job experiences. Taking field trips to inclusive colleges, so those 3 programs in our state, or community colleges. Community colleges are often open access, meaning that students don't have to meet a criteria for admittance, that anybody, no matter what their GPA is, whether they took test scores or not, would be able to start taking courses at a community college. So even just introducing students to being on a community college campus can be a really great way to offer the starting point of this conversation, and if they want to go to college themselves. We want to make sure that people are incorporating person-centered planning goals into the IEP, talking with the student, letting them vocalize their goals and their desires. Advocate for majority of time in inclusive settings. This is a really big part of inclusive higher education. Students are in the typical classroom environment. So the more they can get exposed to that early on, the better. And then also accessing college readiness content as regular course content. So this is mainly for educators. If you guys are focusing on reading comprehension, instead of just reading a book or a magazine, to pull up some of this content on thinkcollege.net, and let's focus on reading information about college for students with disabilities. Make it more of a normative component of your class content. We'd also offer that if you want to invite us to come present and chat with your students, we would love that. I'll share a little bit at the end about some of the curriculum we have available to you. You can participate in mentorship opportunities where students that have graduated from inclusive higher ed programs are coming back to share with students with disabilities in high school about that process, tips, strategies, and that's a really great empowerment system. And then offer college and career exploration as a part of your district transition program, adding this into the normal pathway for students as they leave K-12 education. And I realize that all of us have different experiences, different students. So I just encourage you right where you're at just to consider what are the specific needs of the students that you work with, and how can you consider ideas where you are offering this information and sharing it to them in a way that excites them, encourages them, and gets them ready to dive in. Okay. So now we want to dive into actually how are we preparing for this? How are students, if they know the college options, we're sharing it with them. Now, how are we preparing for it? Which is pretty daunting. Like I said, I know that this is going to be a lot of skills I'm sharing with you guys. So I just encourage you, as you're listening, pull or lean into one or two things that you feel like you can implement right away, and then hold on to the rest of them, put them in your back pocket. It's a long haul as we're working on processing college preparation for students with disabilities. And so I want to present it all to you, but encourage you to take it in stride and be intentional with what you implement in your particular setting. Okay, so as we're looking at academic skills, I'm pulling these images from thinkcollege.net, which is the national research hub for inclusive higher education. They have amazing resources to help parents and educators, and a lot of this I'll send to you at the end of the webinar. But they focus on academic versus non-academic skills. And here's a breakdown of some of the academic ones that are key to student success. So attendance and punctuality is really big. A lot of times at the K-12 level, we're seeing teachers or administrators being the ones that are coordinating the schedule, telling students where to be and when. But we really want to grow in independence with students being able to know when they need to be somewhere, to develop that system of when they need to leave to get to a class on time. So punctuality and maintaining their own schedule is going to be really important. Use of resources outside of just the teacher within your classroom, but knowing that administrators across the campus, counselors, other staff members in your area that can be support to you is really big. Because at the college level, students are having resources all across the board. And so we want them to know how to access that and how to ask for help in all of those areas. Communication is big when it comes to communicating with faculty members or teachers or peers. Knowing how to communicate, how to ask for support is important, as well as quality of work, that students are taking their time, that there's meaning in the work that they're doing, that it's not just a task list or a worksheet, but that there's a purpose, a connection to what's happening after high school for them. Acceptance and direction of constructive criticism, allowing students to navigate how to receive constructive criticism guidance, because that's a big part of our learning and our development. And then technological know-how is really big as well, that students are interacting with an email, that they are starting to open up a Word document or an Excel document. Even if it's just the baby steps, we want to get them started with seeing some of this technology that's going to be very common in the college level as well as post-college when they're in a career. In addition to these, some of the focused academic skills would be basic writing. The unique part is that with inclusive higher education, students don't have to meet a specific academic criteria, right? They don't have to necessarily present a 5-page paper to show what their writing level is, but it still is very important for them to have some baseline of sentence structure and paragraph structure so that they can best communicate within their classes. That is even in line with modifications that they're going to have at their class level, at the college level. We still want them to be able to write as best as they can. And that can be creative. It doesn't have to be our typical expectation of a college student's writing level. It could be with assistive technology. It could be with picture exchange in some way that they're communicating a full sentence, a full thought, or paragraph writing. We want students to be growing in their reading comprehension techniques. So maybe including audiobooks, assistive technology in the classroom, or even helping them to develop the process of annotation. So if you guys are reading something in a class, how can they circle or point out something that stands out to them that they think is important? That's going to be really beneficial across all areas of study at the college level. Additionally, we have knowledge of learning style and preferences, where students would start to identify, how do I learn? How does my brain work? How do I focus best? What are my strengths and weaknesses in that way? And helping them to articulate that. And then also exploring academic interests. If a student identifies that they're interested in something, encouraging them to continue in that, to look up documentaries, to research that on their own, encouraging that exploration is going to be really big. So that's us looking at academic. Now there's a larger list of non-academic skills. First, we're looking at some of our self-advocacy skills, communicating needs, anticipating needs in various settings, advocating for needs when the services they need are not in place. We also have respect and collaboration with people in various settings, whether that be educators or peers, having a flexible attitude and willingness to grow, responsible risk-taking, willing to put themselves out there, to have the confidence to try new things, interpersonal skills, and curiosity. If they're interested in something, how can they dive into that? And then persistence, you're going to hear persistence in regards to college preparation across the board. This is for students with or without disabilities, because college is tricky and there's going to be ebbs and flows. But if a student can start to build resilience and persistence to say, I failed or I made a mistake, but what can I learn from this? We're going to see so much growth in them in the future, helping them to take responsibility and ownership for the work in front of them, the tasks, the expectations set before them, collaborating with peers, being independent and just daily small tasks, and then engaging with the community, knowing that they have a place as something to add to the community. So as we go into some of the specific techniques, we're going to break it down into some of these 4 categories of self-awareness, where students would start to develop awareness of their disability, be able to discuss that with joy and pride, and also define some of their career interests. Then self-advocacy, where we're focusing on decision-making throughout the day, that it's regular and expected of them. Self-management, where students can start to schedule, focus in on the things of their daily routine that they can take ownership of, and gain some personal regulation techniques. And then self-determination, where they are setting goals and they are determining the plan to reach them. So like I said, I know that this is a lot to take in, but we're going to walk through some practical techniques to implement these in the day-to-day. So general techniques for you. On the front end, we want to make sure that we're presuming competence. We want to assume that students are able to be competent in these skills, have that growth mindset in mind, and know that they're able to develop, even if it's slow and progressive, but they're able to grow in each of these competencies in each of these areas. It's really important for us to maintain high expectation as a teacher, a parent, or a provider, but also around any other supports that you're using. So if you have a team of para-educators that you're working with, making sure that they know that expectations are to remain high and to encourage them to reach high expectations. We want to advocate for inclusion with use of natural support. So as much as possible, making sure that students are included with natural supports around them. And then an emphasis in fading supports. Typically, we wait until maybe junior, senior year of a student's high school career that we're starting to fade supports, but the goal is really to start fading as early as we can. Once they're starting to show ownership and independence, we want to make sure that we're pulling away some of those supports so that they can continue to grow in that and strengthen that independence. I'm seeing a quick question from Michelle, which I appreciate. Natural supports, good question. So when we're talking about what are natural supports, how can we consider natural supports? What we're thinking about oftentimes is going to be like a peer support. So if you have students in a typical general education classroom, and maybe they have a para-educator with them, but maybe there's peer work happening in that class, making sure that we empower the student to be interacting with those peers rather than the para-educator being the one communicating for the student, and allowing the natural supports of those peers to teach the student some social interaction, to teach the student how to communicate clearly. So things like that, other staff members on campus that are natural for them. But a lot of times when we're looking at inclusive higher education programs, they're using peer supports as the natural supports because that's pretty normative. The rest of the students are learning experiences, social interactions from their peers. And so putting peers in that leadership role can be a really big benefit.
Perfect. Okay. And then one other quick question. Sorry, your flow is actually really good. This is very interesting. You also had commented on a previous slide about ensuring quality of work. Right?
Yeah.
How, like, I'm the parent on the phone, but
Okay.
I'm begging constantly to have, like, to teach. My son is 11. I want to teach quality of work.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't, like, it's like when you talk to your support team or your services team, it's they look at you like you're kind of crazy.
Mm-hmm.
What do you, like, what's an initial way to start demonstrate? Like, how do we do that?
Yeah, good question. Big question. I would say, Michelle, I think that's a large conversation, but
Agreed.
The thing that comes to mind initially is there should always be a why. So if students are doing work, I want students to know why they're doing that work. What is that linked to in their future goals? That should be the case for all students, let alone students with special education. So identifying a why to every activity or expectation that's being done. And then I think there's a level of just taking assignments slowly and teaching students to review them. I think of, in the work setting, I can blaze through an email, but it's really important. I have to force myself to stop and review that email before it's sent. So even the process of review can add quality to work.
Got it.
Does that make sense? Does that kind of
Yes,
help?
it does. I'm totally in sync with what you're saying. Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for asking, Michelle. Okay, so we're going to keep on going in these general techniques. I love questions, so feel free to throw those in the chat and I'll keep on snagging them if I can. But on the baseline, we want to create classroom environments of choice. So as much as you can create, whether this is at home or in the classroom, where you're constantly asking students to make a choice. That lends itself to us having to let them make choices that maybe we wouldn't make for them, but encouraging them to do that anyways and learn from those experiences. A really good technique would be to have an activity menu on a whiteboard. So if students are completing assignments, when one student is done, that they would be able to look at this activity menu and decide what's one thing they can do to be utilizing their time more meaningfully while they wait for the rest of their peers to complete an assignment. A way to have students add to that is make sure that they're brainstorming with you when you create that activity menu. What are some good, meaningful ways that we can use our time when we're done with work? Allow them to speak into that, because then they're going to have more investment in the choices that they're making. And then this is mainly for our educators, but a gradual release of responsibility for all skills that you're working on. And the method that I tend to focus on is the I do, we do, you do method. So I'm sure most educators know this, but it's where you give a clear example. You're the I. So I do something clearly to give an example to the student, a skill that I'm wanting them to develop. And then we'll do it together where I'm coaching them. We're doing it side by side. And then eventually I want the student to do it where I'm just prompting and maybe guiding so that they have some sense of independence. And then eventually we're moving them to that full independent arena where I'm not even there to guide or prompt, but I can let them try, maybe fail and fumble, but navigate the skill on their own and then reflect on it. So this is really when we're talking about fading supports, when we're talking about skill implementation, following this gradual release of responsibility is going to be huge for their confidence development, but also for the educators and the parents to feel confident when they're releasing the student to independent work. And overall, we want to have these students incorporated into their IEP goal writing, that it would focus on their college goals, their career goals, and that would be included. So here, these are such great resources for IEP goal writing. I couldn't even begin to dive into them because they're so robust. And so these are here for you guys to access afterwards. But Think College has a long list of specific IEP goals that are measurable, attainable, that you can implement for your students. So I encourage you guys to look through those, see what would be meaningful for them. And then there's also tips specifically for the IEP team, how they can continue using person-centered planning, making sure the student is at the forefront of that and leading even their IEP meetings. So that's a big component of just our general techniques to increase some college skill development. Okay, we're going to keep on going. I know I'm giving you guys a lot, but we're going to focus in on specific techniques for self-awareness. So these are just ideas, some things that we've heard that have gone well in the K-12 classroom as they prepare for college. But again, this is a wide area, and then you can determine what's actually appropriate for your particular setting and your particular students. So the first specific technique would be to have students create personal profiles, including things like their disability information, strengths that come with that, learning preferences, communication preferences. This is really helpful for them to share with any new teachers they interact with at the K-12 level, but also they can have that to provide to inclusive higher education professionals, to faculty that they interact with, so that faculty have a better understanding of who the students they are serving are. And this is just a great way for students to take ownership, to dive into who they are and to know those details about themselves. We also encourage that you teach students to identify and communicate their accommodations and modifications. So rather than just implementing modifications and accommodations, scheduling 15 minutes with each student to share, hey, here are the ones that we're we're implementing in this class? Do you know why we're implementing that? Do you know what this accommodation means? Starting that awareness piece now is going to be huge for them as they transition to higher education. We're going to increase student choices and use those natural consequences as teachable moments. So we chatted a bit about this, but increasing options for students to select from and letting them select maybe something that you wouldn't, and then reviewing that, asking them how that went. Maybe an example would be if they're taking on some independence to go to classes on their own. If they leave a little bit late and then they show up to class late, reflecting with them. What do you think you could do differently next time? Maybe we need to leave a few minutes early, things like that, where you're starting to reflect with them. This is a great resource, Going to College. It's a very interactive website online for students with disabilities preparing for higher ed. Tons and tons of resources there, but specifically this resource and this link is going to take students to develop a My Place, which is kind of like an electronic personal profile where they can start to track their learning style, disability details, etc. So that's a really great way to start that in the class while using technology. And then utilizing the know, want, and learn method. So this is really simple, but if a student ever offers interest or expresses interest in some new topic, having them identify or write down, what do you know about that topic currently? What do you want to know about that topic? And then encourage them to learn it, to access it through resources, and then write down or communicate what they learned afterwards. This is going to show them the progression of thought for them, that they came up with an idea, something that interested them. They had some knowledge about it, but they can always grow in it. And that's a really great method for them when it comes to general information, but also if they're in a college class. After a college class, to sit down, what did they know about that content? What did they want to know about that content? And what did they just learn about that content? So now we're going to pivot towards self-advocacy, which is a very broad topic, but is really huge for students' success in the future. So some specific techniques to increase advocacy would be have students complete a learning preference assessment and then discuss that with their peers. So if they were to figure out what type of learner they are and then have to share that with somebody in their class, that's going to challenge them to communicate about their needs, their preferences, their style, and kind of have some pride in that. Students meet with each teacher and paraeducator to discuss accommodations and modifications. I realize that at the K-12 level, most, if not all, of the teachers your students are working with know about the required accommodations and modifications. So this isn't necessarily to inform those teachers because they're already informed, but to give the student practice of communicating what services they need, building relationship with that particular teacher. And this is big because any student, whether they're in an inclusive higher education program or not, at the college level, they're going to be required to communicate about those needs with their faculty, with support, of course, but it's great if they have experience with that in a safer, maybe more comfortable environment like their K-12 school. Okay, and then we also have practice with students to identify, find, and register for events or activities that interest them. So if they have something that is interesting, empower them to find ways to get involved, to not just passively observe, but to be active in it. Provide a template to students to develop and utilize for student-led IEPs. So kind of giving them a guide and then having a rehearsal time with them, letting them have a safe place where they can figure out how to communicate what they want to their IEP team. That can feel really daunting for students, but if they have practice and rehearsal with you, they have a guide in front of them, that's going to set them up for success. And this is a big one that is very common at the college level and not common at the K-12 level, which is including students in email communication. And I recognize that a lot of our students have zero interest at the K-12 level to read an email, but it is really important for them to start to navigate that system. And so whenever there's an appropriate communication between a parent or another provider on campus, it's great to CC the student into that so that they know there are conversations about them, concerns, encouragement, celebration, whatever it might be, and then really encouraging them to check that so that they're seeing these communications happen and having an eye on their email all at the same time. All right, we're going to go into self-management techniques. So something that would be beneficial is to include 10 to 15 minutes each week in your classroom to have an email check where everybody and whatever device they use or whatever system they tend to communicate with parents or educators or peers, to have them check that and just to have this routine time that they're checking their emails. That's a great way to get that into their typical rhythm. Create a class preparation checklist where students have a specific checklist before they go into class each morning, considering what assignments are due, what notes they might need, what materials they might need, or even considering what are some topics they could talk through as they're entering into class. So it's like a mental preparation before the school day starts. All right. Coaching students to have a list of helpful coping strategies in various settings. We can also really want to encourage ownership of a schedule, encouraging students to have a tracking app for their calendar and prompting them to put in notes and reminders on their own rather than just the parent or the educator providing that to them. And then have students develop a vitamin taking system, which is kind of a starting point for their medication management. That's a great, safe way to start. And lastly, provide a syllabus or outline of each unit you're going through as an educator so that students are used to checking an outline or checking a syllabus as a way to know what's coming. That's a great method for them to prepare for their college coursework. And this is our last slide for specific techniques when we're focusing on self-determination. Offer career assessments and exploration, giving them chances to consider what they want to do. Coordinate job shadowing and internships. Guide students to develop a portfolio of accomplishments. This can be in addition to that personal profile they create. Provide graphic organizers to aid in goal identification, where they start with their big goal and transition down to what are the small steps to get me there. Offer opportunities for peer leadership within the class. If they're owning a skill, encouraging them to be a peer leader with other students in their classrooms. Enable independent navigation on campus, allowing for mistakes as that comes, but encouraging as best as possible that they take on independence, going from the classroom to the cafeteria, etc. And then lastly, I encourage that our service providers, educators are connecting our students and our families to the Division of Voc Rehab, because they can be a huge resource for career development, even like Tracy and I mentioned, or even for financial support for college in the future. So this is an example. These are 3 students that have gone through the Inclusive Higher Education program in Colorado. Ashley, she's a student who was focused on advocacy and disability services. She worked at the ARC in their advocacy program and is doing amazing work to increase disability awareness in our state. Nick in the middle, he is running his own photojournalism company and pursuing more entrepreneurship pathways. And that's Mia over on the right, where she is teaching ASL to preschoolers. So these students have developed so many skills and are putting them into practice in our community. And it's amazing to watch. This is a list for those parents. I'm not going to go over all these details, but for parents that are considering how can we implement some of these skills at home, there's some key strategies to start doing that here. Overall, I just want to point out that inclusive higher education, college pathways for students with intellectual disabilities is robust and holistic. We want them to be growing in academics and social and independence and career. And it's a really worthwhile thing to start prepping them for early on. So I'm going to leave these closing remarks up for you guys. I know we only have a few minutes left, so I want to give some space for questions, but I do want to encourage you that with all this information, you're not alone. I want to be a resource to you. So if you have any specific questions, please feel free to reach out. We want to connect you with agencies and organizations in the community that would help you. And we also want you to feel like you can connect your students to them. And then also another reminder to not take on every single skill at once. Slow down, take this all in stride, and consider what's the most meaningful skill I can start implementing here and now, today or tomorrow, for my students or the students that I work with. Well, I'm going to leave this up here for some ongoing information for you, links to our website, but specifically for our teachers, I want to remind you that we have a self-paced 5-module series all about inclusive higher education that goes into more of these details so that you feel more equipped to talk to your students and your parents about it. So that's linked there, as well as started a college and career curriculum that we offer to bring into schools. So if you're ever interested in having us bring that into your classroom, we would love to do that. So feel free to reach out to us directly. That's a little bit more nuanced, but we would love to do that. Wonderful. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate your time. I'll hang tight for last few questions, and then I will send out this recording and a lot of resources coming your way. I hope that's helpful and not overwhelming, but thank you guys for taking the time to join us and be interested in how to best equip our students with intellectual disabilities for college.